Hello, we're going to continue learning about the unit circle, and it's really important that you know this entire thing. You should be able to draw all of this by yourself, like from memory. So let's talk about what we already know. So a unit circle is a circle with radius 1, and we have coordinates for each angle here. The x-coordinate is the cosine of the angle, and the y-coordinate is the sine of the angle. Okay, so we know some special angles already. We know the multiples of 90, 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 270 degrees, and back to 360. And knowing that this is a circle with radius 1, if you think of this as the origin, this is 1, 0, 0, 1, negative 1, 0, and 0, negative 1. So what this tells us is, for example, we know the x-coordinate's cosine, so the cosine of 0 degrees is 1. Likewise, here for 270 degrees, the y-coordinate is the sine. So the sine of 270 degrees is negative 1. Okay? We also know these ones in the first quadrant, particularly 30 degrees, 45 degrees, and 60 degrees. So cosine of 30 degrees is root 3 over 2. The sine of 30 degrees is 1/2. Okay, for x and y, we know the sine and cosine of 45 degrees is root 2 over 2. And for 60 degrees, cosine of 60 degrees is 1/2. The sine is root 3 over 2. Okay. There are other angles you are responsible for knowing. Those are the multiples of 30. So you see we have 30, 60, 90. Another multiple of 30 is 120 degrees, 150 degrees, 180, 210, 240, 270, 300, 330, and back around to 360. We'll talk about what the coordinates are in just a little bit. And then also the multiples of 45. 45, 90, 135, 180, 210, 225, 270, and 315. So all these angles here, you will need to know how to find the sine and cosine of these angles. So the way we find that, the sine and cosine of all these other angles, the key thing is knowing the reference angle. So let's look at 120 degrees in particular. Use a blank unit circle here to avoid confusion. This is a 120 degree angle. You know, if we start here, the x-axis, 120 degrees. And if we draw in our triangle, it looks something like this. So you always want to draw a triangle with the x-axis. Now, what we want to find is the reference angle. That's the angle, the number of degrees away from the x-axis. So here, the reference angle is 60. And the way we found this, 180 minus 120 is 60 degrees. Remember, reference angle is always positive and it's always acute. So when you find the coordinates here, really what you're using is the cosine of 60 degrees and the sine of 60 degrees. We know the cosine of 60 degrees is 1/2, and the sine of 60 degrees is root 3 over 2. But remember, we're not actually finding the sine and cosine of 60 degrees. We want the sine and cosine of 120 degrees. So think about where this point is on your coordinate plane, like the x comma y. So this is in the second quadrant. In the second quadrant, x is negative, and y is positive. That's why instead of having x comma y be 1/2 comma root 3 over 2, it would actually be negative 1/2 comma root 3 over 2. Okay, so I can fill in these coordinates on my unit circle here. Negative 1/2 comma root 3 over 2. Okay, I can do the same thing with the 135-degree angle. Okay, so here I have a 135-degree angle. So one makes 135 degrees from this positive x-axis. And our reference angle, we do 180 minus 135, and that is 45 degrees. So now we have, let's draw our triangle in. And now we want to think, what is the cosine and sine of 45 degrees? That is root 2 over 2 and root 2 over 2. Again, think we are in the second quadrant. So our coordinates aren't just root 2 over 2 comma root 2 over 2. The x has to be negative because x is negative in the second quadrant. Y is positive. So our coordinates here are negative root 2 over 2 comma root 2 over 2. Okay, so remember, if you want to find the cosine of 135 degrees, now we know it's negative root 2 over 2. The sine of 135 degrees is root 2 over 2. So let's just recap. When we have the signs here, in the first quadrant, both x and y are positive. So both cosine and sine are positive. But in the second quadrant, x is negative and y is positive. So positive is the sine and negative is the cosine. Okay, so I want you to try to find the coordinates here, or the cosine and sine of 150 degrees. Okay, so you should have gotten negative root 3 over 2 comma 1/2. Okay, now let's move into the third quadrant. We actually do the same thing. We have to find the reference angle. Now, but before we do, think about positive and negative. Is the x and y coordinates positive or negative? So they're both negative. Down here, your x is negative, your y is negative. So both cosine and sine are negative. So let's look at this 210-degree angle in particular. So I'm going to pull up an empty unit circle here. This is a 210-degree angle. Okay, so this is our reference angle. To find our reference angle, we want to find how the degrees of separation from the x-axis. So we want to do 210 minus 180. We get 30 degrees. Okay. So if we look at our triangle, it's like finding the sine and cosine of 30 degrees. So cosine of 30 degrees is root 3 over 2, and the sine of 30 degrees is 1/2. Okay, but remember, we're not actually finding the sine and cosine of 30 degrees. We want 210 degrees. So we have to think, is sine and cosine positive or negative here? Okay, remember, this point here is in the third quadrant. Both x and y are negative, so we have negative root 3 over 2, comma negative 1/2. Okay, so let's fill that in. Okay, now what I want you to do is find the coordinates for 225 degrees and 240 degrees. Okay, you should have gotten negative root 2 over 2, comma, negative root 2 over 2. And here, for 240, negative 1/2, comma, negative root 3 over 2. Okay. Now, the last quadrant here is the fourth quadrant, and x is positive, y is negative. So cosine is going to be positive, and sine is going to be negative. Okay. So let's look at the 300-degree angle. Here, let me pull up an empty unit circle, or a blank one. So here, this is 300 degrees. Okay. Now the reference angle is the angle it makes with the x-axis. I can't stress that enough. X-axis, always x-axis. So you always draw your triangle going to the x-axis. Okay. So what's our reference angle? To find our reference angle, remember this is a 0-degree angle, or 360. So we take 360 minus 300, and we get 60 degrees. So this is a 60-degree angle. Now to find the coordinates, remember, cosine is x, sine is y. So we need to think of what is the cosine and sine of 60 degrees. Okay, cosine of 60 degrees is 1/2. Sine of 60 degrees is root 3 over 2. But think, x is positive, y is negative. So we have positive 1/2 and then negative root 3 over 2. Let's fill that in. Here, x for 300 degrees, x is 1/2, y is negative root 3 over 2. Okay? Now I want you to find the coordinates for 315 degrees and 310 degrees. 330 degrees. Okay, for 315, you should have gotten root 2 over 2, comma, negative root 2 over 2. And for 300, you should have gotten root 3 over 2, comma, negative 1/2. So now, for all these angles, our unit circles allows us to find sine and cosine very easily for any of these special angles here. So for example, if you wanted to find the sine of 225 degrees, look at your unit circle, and sine we know is the y-coordinate. So sine of 225 degrees is negative root 2 over 2. If we wanted to find the cosine of 330 degrees, okay, cosine is the x-coordinate. The x-coordinate is root 3 over 2.